Hello, friends and nonprofit leaders. Laura Zelke here. I'm your host of the Your Nonprofit Life podcast, and today I'm starting a new series which will hopefully enlighten you to what's happening in our country from some of the most informed sources I know, the nonprofit leaders who are in the trenches doing the actual, real, hard work. And let me tell you, the interviews are riveting. During the month of October, we'll learn about what's happening across the border at the refugee camps in Matamoros, Mexico, and we'll also learn how the drastically reduced number of refugees and asylees who are allowed into the United States has forced the closure of local resettlement agencies and how one local organization has risen to the challenge and is ready to grow. We'll also learn about voter education and empowerment from a woman whose nonprofit journey took an unexpected turn that literally changed the trajectory of her life. And since October is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we'll also hear from the founder of a grassroots organization in Washington, D.C. that provides free, culturally specific, holistic, and trauma-based services to Black women survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. The next 4 episodes are informative, entertaining, and empowering. I hope you'll listen to each episode and let me know what you think. Now, allow me to introduce you to today's guest. Helen Perry is the Executive Director of Global Response Management, an organization that delivers emergency medical care and humanitarian relief to vulnerable people in the most high-risk areas. While Helen's team is typically responding to crises in the Middle East, think Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Bangladesh. Over the past couple of years, they've been serving a lot closer to home, across the border in Matamoros, Mexico. Helen is a fearless leader who has taken this incredible organization from the brink of extinction to a place of thriving and growth, all in less than 2 years, one of which is 2020, by the way. I'm really excited for you to meet Helen. She's a powerful leader and a very pregnant mom-to-be. Hey, have you ever wished you could hear some good news for a change? Well, I might have just what you've been hoping for. Welcome to Your Nonprofit Life, where we remove our rose-colored glasses and explore what leaders are actually doing to move their nonprofits from messy to thriving without burning out in the process. I'm Laura Zelke, Director of Member Experience for the Nonprofit Leadership Lab. Join me each week to explore the ups, downs, and whoopsie daisies of your nonprofit life. Let's get started. Helen, welcome to the Your Nonprofit Life podcast. I'm so excited to have you on. You've kind of been on my wish list since before we even started.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Laura.
Well, I'm excited, and it looks like you're very comfortable. I see a beautiful quilt behind you.
Yeah, this is a quilt my husband got when he got injured in Afghanistan. Also does well to keep the cat hair off the chairs. Since I'm like 8 months pregnant right now, he has set me up this very cushy situation in a lazy boy, a little table to work from so that I can be comfortable while I'm still working from home. So,
wow. Well, congratulations on your pregnancy. Do you know what you're having?
it's a boy.
Oh, yay. And name? Still working on that?
Still don't know. Yeah, we had been told for like 10 years we couldn't have our own kids, and this was a total surprise. They actually think I had COVID back in February and was in the hospital with a collapsed lung. And then 8 weeks later, I was actually working in Mexico, and they told me I was pregnant. And I was like 10 years? No, it's not going to happen. Sure enough, here we are, and he's healthy and great. So we're very excited.
Oh, that's so exciting. And I really can't wait for the listeners to hear about your organization. And I know everyone will be sending their well wishes for a healthy delivery. As someone who struggled a little bit with infertility, I totally understand, just that, I don't know, maybe a little fear, a little,
anxious.
It's actually happening. Yeah. And it's just such a special time. And so I wish you a healthy delivery and healthy baby and get a lot of sleep right now is all I got to say, if possible. Although we are recording this the day after the first presidential debate. And I have to say that was interesting.
Yeah. I
Holy
had a lot of heartburn yesterday after
guacamole.
that.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so let's get into our interview today. At the beginning, I will have already told just a brief snippet of what your organization does.
Okay.
I wanted to go ahead and give you the opportunity to tell us who you are, what you do, and what your organization does.
Sure. So I'm Helen Perry. I'm the executive director for global response management. I'm also an acute care nurse practitioner. I've done about 10 years in the military, 11 years in the military now. I did 5 years on active duty, where I specifically focused on war trauma. I was trained by the military to work in trauma and learned how to work in low resource environments and austere environments. And then my husband got injured in Afghanistan. He had a traumatic brain injury and developed epilepsy and severe memory loss. So we always joke, because if you've seen the movie 50 First Dates, where she has no memory, that's kind of our life.
Is it really?
A little bit, yeah. It's not every day. He always says that his spirit animal is Dory from Finding Nemo.
Oh, I love Dory.
When I left active duty, I had always had this kind of soft spot and this desire to work in humanitarian aid and disaster settings after seeing the tsunamis in Thailand or earthquakes in Haiti. And so right after I got off of active duty in the military, I was asked if I would go to Iraq with an organization, the organization I work for now, Global Response Management, to help run trauma stabilization points for civilians who were injured in the fight to push out ISIS from the city. And so I was like, yeah, like I'm uniquely suited to do this. I have the experience and capabilities. And so I went and I started as just a regular volunteer. And then I went to Bangladesh, and then I helped run the programs in Yemen and Syria, but I didn't actually physically go. Although when I was in Iraq, we were kind of ish near the Syrian border. And then I went to the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian, and then I became the executive director and started our project now working in cartel-controlled Mexico.
Okay, and we're definitely going to talk about that as we go through the interview today, because I feel like the work that you're doing there, we're a little not hearing about it
Yeah.
these days. I don't understand why we're not hearing about it, but we're really not hearing too much about what's going on down at the southern border. And so I definitely want to ask you about that. So you've been doing this while your husband has been dealing with the traumatic brain injury. Yeah. And so do you have a good support network at home as far as like when you're gone? That there's someone comes in and kind of helps him?
It's gotten a lot better over the years. Being a nurse practitioner really sort of gave me a leg up in terms of his recovery, to kind of know when the military doctors would say there's no more improvement to be made, I would be like, not so. I do not accept that answer. And so I actually got really involved with veterans advocacy as well, and caregiver advocacy with another organization just as a volunteer, working to advocate for caregivers of wounded service members. And so through sort of those connections, we've been able to really get him to the best care possible. And he's great. Like, to look at him, you would never know that he had such a devastating brain injury and seizures and memory loss. And then people will talk to him and be like, oh, like he doesn't remember his childhood. Like there's nothing there. So it's always kind of funny, because we'll go to do things, and especially like picking out stuff for the baby. And I'll be like, no, don't you remember? Like, these toys are better. And he's like, no, I don't remember. Wow. So he has a really good sense of humor about it, though. He'll tell you that like TV's great because every show is a new show. He can watch the same things over again. He's totally content. He has a great sense of humor about it. And definitely in the last 3 or 4 years, he's made huge progress just in terms of like being self-sufficient. Not that he doesn't still have challenges, but he has sort of changed his focus from, being like an infantry Marine like he was, to now supporting me and the work that I do, and making it so that I can go out and do what I'm doing, which is really great.
Yeah, that's really just inspiring. On behalf of myself, and I know the listeners, just please, pass along our gratitude to him for the sacrifice. And thank you too, because military spouses, you have also a very big sacrifice and a big stake in the game. And the fact that you were also active duty, I mean, just thank you. Thank you
Thank you for the support.
So as we talk a little bit about your nonprofit and what the work that you're doing, so you were on active duty and you served over in Iraq while they were trying to push out ISIS?
I was still in the reserves, actually. When I went to Iraq, I actually went as a humanitarian. So I didn't go like a deployment setting like you would with the military, which I think is actually a little bit more intimidating because you're not armed. You're there as a civilian. We did have interactions with coalition forces that were there, but we were not like embedded with them or part of them. And what we did was we set up trauma stabilization points for civilians who were injured during the war. What a lot of people don't realize is that when a war breaks out in a country, and especially for ISIS, one of the first things ISIS did was they destabilized the healthcare infrastructure in all of Iraq and Syria. They went in, they stole supplies, they bombed hospitals, they targeted healthcare personnel. And the reason that they did that was because it's a control element. Because when you have people who need healthcare, a diabetic who needs insulin, or a child who has special needs, you now have a source of control over that family. And you can say, and they did, join us and we'll give you insulin or you die. And people did. A lot of the following that they had was coercion and was out of desperation. And so the Mosul, the city that we were working in, is a city of about 1.5 million. About 700,000 people fled during the fighting and went to other areas. We call those IDPs, internally displaced people. But like 750,000 people stayed. And imagine, sort of the analogy that I give people is, imagine standing in, say, Santa Monica, California, and getting injured and having to walk to LA proper to go to a hospital. They don't survive. And so what we did was we would set up in areas where we knew that we could be safe, but where people could also get to us. And we provided that first stage critical healthcare. It was a lot of trauma work, also a lot of primary care, infections. Give them the opportunity to survive to get there. And of the 10,000 patients that we estimate we treated over 9 months, we had about a 94% survival rate, which is really, really good.
Yeah, that's incredible. And so I'm really curious to find out from you. So you were volunteering over there, right?
Yeah.
And now you're running the organization that you were volunteering for. How did that happen?
Yes. When I first went to Iraq, I was pretty naive and just inexperienced in working specifically in humanitarian medical aid or humanitarian medicine. I really had no idea how corrupt it can be, how inefficient. My exposure to sort of international medicine had always been with the military, which is, it suffers from its own inefficiencies and its own problems for sure. But for the most part, they've got this down. They've been doing this successfully since World War I. And so when I went into this kind of work in Iraq and some of the other areas that I went to, I was really like, why are we doing this way? This makes no sense. Like, why are they setting up these massive first world, essentially hospital complexes in an area that has like no power? That makes no sense. Somebody had donated a CT scanner to the hospital in Iraq. And if they used the CT scanner, it would shut down the power grid in the entire city for like 4.5 hours.
Oh my God.
I was like, why have we done this? Like, this is not effective. And so one of the things I loved about GRM was that their approach was very efficient. It was very much so based on the military model of forward medical operations. So I was, used to it and I understood it, and it was practical. And it was literally putting life-saving medicine into some of these areas where traditional organizations, I won't go through and name names, but people can probably think of some very big name organizations that have lots of very fancy commercials. And I will tell you that I didn't see any of those guys while I was there. And in fact, several of them refused to go. And so that was sort of my first encounter. I had some really negative experiences with other big name organizations that were claiming to do work there, but really weren't. And so I really just felt drawn towards making a change and specifically focusing on areas of the world that are high risk or impacted by war and conflict, because those are most often the areas where other organizations won't go.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we do now. Kept getting involved with the organization. I kept offering to help. We were small startup, like most, I think, nonprofits do. It's a couple of friends, a couple of people that know each other. They band together, they get the paperwork done, and then it's like, okay, now what? And so I just kept doing things. I took over fundraising, and then I did social media, and then I went to Bangladesh and helped get that set up. And then they asked me to be on the board. And so then I started getting involved that way. And then the next thing that I know, I'm running the organization and the executive director. So it's evolved very quickly.
I have a little insight in that you and I have been connected for, I don't know when you joined the lab, but I remember this one time, were you in Thailand? And we
Yes,
were chatting on Messenger, and just set this up for me. Were you not working full time as a
I
nurse at
was.
that point?
I was
So,
working full time as a nurse practitioner, so even worse. I had worse hours than a nurse. Yeah.
so nurse practitioner full time, and then also you weren't executive director quite yet, but things were a little haywire at the organization. And what was that about?
So our operations, like many organizations, we had the same struggles that a lot of people had. One of our projects put us $20,000 into debt, which nonprofits can't have debt. We were a mess. It was, as happens with a lot of nonprofits, right? Like things,
Right.
you get the cart in front of the horse, and then the next thing you know, you're like, oh my gosh. I think the conversation we were having in Thailand was like, we either have to close like immediately
Yeah.
or I have to fix this.
Right. And that was from some work that you were trying to do over in Yemen, right?
Yeah, so that was our Yemen project, had put us substantially into debt. One of the things that I have learned in the nonprofit world is a lot of people will tell you that they've got money for you. If I had a dime for every time somebody offered me a grant or a donation. And so you really have to learn scale and how to work with what you have, not what you want to have.
Mm,
And so we got into trouble. And quite literally, we were at a point, I was paying our bills off of my own salary, off my own money, because I just really believed in the work that we were doing. But I was just in this desperate, and I'm sure like, some of the listeners can relate to that, where you feel so strongly and so connected to a cause and it's just not coming together.
yeah.
Something has to change. You just don't know how. So I think that was where I was like, help, what do I do?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a heck of a journey for sure.
Yeah. And so you got through that. And how did you get from that moment? Like, think about that moment and how you were feeling so overwhelmed. I remember. And this is part of the reason I think deep inside, I just love so much supporting people like you, because you're so committed and you're so in and you're trying so hard. And there really are those days when it's like, oh my gosh, what do I do? You know, do we just close up or do we keep going? And I feel like on some level, that's the importance of the work that we're doing in the lab. Yes, we train people running a board meeting or how to be an executive director or whatnot, but there is this camaraderie that we've developed to kind of keep people in the game. Like, we keep you going, don't quit. You will get through this and get you to the other side so that you do keep going and you continue the important work that you're doing. And it just is so fulfilling for me personally, just to be able to have kind of the inside scoop on it and know that, yeah, like we can really hopefully just be there on those days when it's
Yeah.
hard. And so when you think back to that conversation that we had when you were in Thailand and how overwhelmed you were and how things were so crazy at the organization, and then, fast forward to where you are now, how did you become the executive director of the organization? And then I definitely want to get into what you're doing down at the southern
Sure.
border. But how did you get from being a full-time nurse practitioner, $20,000 in debt, to where you are today?
I'm not going to lie. It was a lot of soul searching on my part, a lot of like sleepless nights, that like gut feeling, just like you're sick to your stomach because you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I think it was, I can't remember, like, I think Joan had thrown out some advice and then you were throwing out some advice and you guys both just kind of said, like, do you believe in this enough to stick it out? And that was essentially like the question. And my answer to that was yes, like this is needed. Like hardly any other organizations do this and do it well. And like, I
Right.
know that we can do it well. And then I think kind of the advice was like, okay, well, then you need to triage it and you need to fix it and you need to start over. And really, when you're that far in debt, you're really like, you're starting at a negative. You're not even just starting over. So that's what I did. You recommended doing a brain dump. I had all of these like, oh my gosh, like
Mhm.
when your to-do list is literally so long that you just can't put any kind of like order or rhyme or reason to it. So I literally sat down with like a notebook and a pen and just started writing like things that needed
Mhm.
to get fixed. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think I had, I was using like an 8x11 steno pad, and I think I had like 10 pages. I mean, I just had like,
Wow.
I mean, literally just everything from finances to insurance to paying off bills to donor relations to, registration to fundraising, blah, blah, blah. And then I just went through and I said, okay, what are the things I have to do now? Okay, I need a plan for paying off debt. How am I going to do that? Well, this is how much money we have. You have to work to make money, and you have to make money to work. So we got to find projects. We got to keep moving. We got to get some funding. How are we going to do this? So I was sort of going through that process as Hurricane Dorian and some of what was going on at the southern border was kind of evolving. And so I was like, okay, like we just need to keep fulfilling our mission. We need to figure out how we do this on no money with volunteers and volunteer equipment and volunteer supplies. And sort of at the same time, the individual who was doing the business side of the house, or who had been, stepped down. And so I assumed all of those responsibilities, just kept doing it. And then, it came time to it. And it kind of got to a point where they were, talking about titles. A different individual in the organization still had the title of executive director at that time. And I said, listen, if I'm going to do the work, you're going to give me the title. I'm not going to do this and put this work and this effort into it and sort of be this like side piece. Like it's all or nothing. And so they
Right.
agreed to that. I became a non-voting member of the board, to sort of separate and keep from having that conflict of interest. And then, and I just started going through and using, I still have that list, and I still occasionally go back to it to reference to make sure that I'm not missing things. But I just started fixing things, and you just get to work,
Yeah, you kind of buckle down and just get it done.
Yep.
And I'll put up some notes maybe about how to do a brain dump, because I have found that to be a really effective way of getting yourself out of the overwhelm and just getting yourself to a point that you kind of have an action plan. Like you can't do everything, but you can do this. And it gets you over that hump of just feeling paralyzed in a way of not really knowing. And so, first of all, congratulations. I was so excited when I heard the news that you were the executive director now. And I know that for a while now, you've been going down to the southern border here in the United States. You're at a place, it's right across the border, right? In Matamoros?
Yep, it's in Matamoros, Mexico.
Okay.
So it's right across the border from Brownsville, Texas. And to give people a little bit of background and kind of context, so our organization specifically, like I said earlier, works in high-risk areas. And I am pretty confident it's not a surprise to most people that organized crime is pretty heavily prevalent in Mexico. I think what probably most people don't know is that is the fourth largest war that is currently ongoing. I mean, it ranks up there with Afghanistan, Syria. The area of Mexico that we're working in has I think it's a level 1 State Department warning. I have to look up the level. But it's basically a do not travel State Department warning because it's so dangerous. We're not just talking about sort of what you see on TV with like a couple of guys with some guns that shoot out. This is military-like tactics. They have rockets, they have grenades, they have all of the same equipment and capabilities that we saw from ISIS in the Middle East. And they use those same tactics, in fact. And so the big misconception that people have about what's happening at the southern border is in our country, we call them immigrants. And that's actually not accurate. An immigrant is somebody who comes to this country for a better economic opportunity. That's somebody who says, you know what, I'm going to go there and work because the jobs pay more. What we're seeing at the southern border is a refugee crisis. These are women, children, families fleeing the exact same types of violence that we saw from ISIS. The stories that I have witnessed, the stories that I have been told are unimaginably horrific. Children being tortured, children being murdered, women being mutilated, all because of they didn't pay an extortion fee. Their family was affiliated with the wrong gang. They traveled the wrong side of town, XYZ, pick your reason. And so it's this huge misconception that this is like an immigration issue, and it's not, it's a refugee issue. And at the southern border between Tijuana and Matamoros, Mexico, Tijuana is the farthest western city, Matamoros is the farthest eastern city. between those 2 points, there are about 60,000 refugees currently waiting on asylum in the United States.
Wow.
And the conditions that they live in are horrible, put it frankly. These are refugee camps, the same kinds of refugee camps that I've seen in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Bangladesh. It is literally 15 feet from the US border. From parts of the camp, I can throw a rock and hit the United States across the river from the Rio Grande. I mean, it's insane. And the problem is they're not safe because the cartels still have access to them. They are still at risk from the original cartels that they've had threat from in their home countries. Governments still have access to them if they're fleeing from places like Venezuela or Nicaragua. And, our work there is providing emergency medical care. In the last year, we've treated about 10,000 patients. It's just incredible that this is, normally I take an 18-hour flight to get to these kinds of conditions. And here I just walk across the border.
Wow. And I don't want to get into too much politics because, with nonprofit and all of the regulations and everything, yet you're telling me that what's going on right across our border is similar to things that you see in Iraq. And I'm trying to understand or wrap my head around why we're having this crisis at the border. What is it that is causing this?
Yeah.
How did this happen when we are America, this first world country, that we're a democracy, a republic? And what's a way to fix this problem?
Yeah. So to give some context to it, you have to understand that asylum in the United States, coming here as an asylum seeker or a refugee, somebody who's being actively persecuted for race, religion, creed, gender, etc., versus an immigrant, those are two different processes, right? And I think immigrants, we accept about 2 million a year. Refugees, we accept less than 40,000 a year. And it's actually the administration that determines how many refugees we're going to accept every year. And since the 1970s, when we actually formally started a refugee acceptance process, we have really well established resources, in the United States for refugees. We can help them get jobs, we can help them learn English, we can help them get integrated, all these things. There's all these programs that exist. And if you look historically at refugee populous areas in the United States, they tend to have lower crime. They tend to have more entrepreneurial businesses. They tend to have better school. These are just hardworking people coming here to have a better life, right? And to be safe. When the current administration took over, they sort of warped what was going on at the southern border to create this quote, immigration crisis, right? These are rapists. They said all these terrible things. Mm-hmm. And to not get into the politics too much, basically what they did was they created this process called MPP, which is the Migrant Protection Protocol. It's also called Remain in Mexico. And what that means is that when somebody reports to a U.S. port of entry and legally requests asylum, and they start that process, instead of being allowed into the United States to go through that court process and to get into and established in these existing refugee infrastructure and networks, they now have to wait in Mexico. And the agreement was that Mexico would take care of them. Well, that doesn't happen. First of all, neither government has provided a single dollar in international humanitarian aid to provide medical housing. I can tell you right now that the accepted international guidelines for water, sanitation, and hygiene, gender-based violence, medical care, housing, everything. Those are called the SPHERE guidelines. Those are openly being ignored by both countries, which, we've signed on to the Geneva Convention. We participate with the UN programs. We accept that those are the minimum standards that people are entitled to as basic human rights, and we are not following them.
Mm-hmm. So when you say we, you're not talking about global response management. You're talking about the United States of America.
Yeah. I'm talking about the U.S. government. Because traditionally, when you look at humanitarian crises, governments are the ones who fund the responses. They're the ones that advocate for basic human rights. They're the ones that uphold those laws and those tenets that we're going to abide by this, right? And neither the United States nor Mexico has done that. And they have openly, knowingly accepted the living conditions that these individuals are being subjected to, and then done nothing to fix it. So the entirety of this response for 60,000 refugees is being done on private donors, which I think is really incredible and really just is a testament to the spirit of people in the United States who get it. And I think it's also really tragic that we are willing to turn our back on 60,000 families, women, and children out of politics. It doesn't really make sense to me. So we've been working down there. The conditions are now with COVID are getting worse. We're actually seeing an increased number of people being displaced into these camps because of either COVID or because people don't stop needing asylum because there's a pandemic.
Right.
And in fact, what we're actually seeing is it's making it worse because these sort of global collapsing economies are driving extremism. For example, in Central and South America, those cartels are heavily funded by drug sale. Well, right now in the United States, most of the bars have been closed, which means most of the drug sales have gone away. And so now they're starting to feel the financial pressure, which means they're turning to kidnapping and extortion even more, which means they're starting to take on more extreme tactics, which means governments are getting increasingly pressured to take action against them, which is creating more fighting, which means more people are displacing, which means more people need to be safe, which means more people are coming because they need somewhere to go that's safe.
Yeah, it's spiraling.
Yeah. It's hard. We tell people all the time, our job is not in the politics, our job is the medicine. But what's currently happening at the US-Mexico border is going to be one of those things that we look back on years from now and have to answer for, And I think that it's something that we really just can't ignore. And we really need to start calling a spade, right? Like, this isn't an immigration crisis, it's a refugee crisis.
Yeah.
The reason I think that people don't like that terminology is it makes them feel uncomfortable, and it should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not been framed like a refugee crisis. It's really been framed kind of almost as an invasion, and it's concerning. And so, first of all, thank you for the important work that you're doing down there. Seeing 1,000 humans over the last year since all of this has been going on. I know it's been challenging, and you've gone down there a number of times. And so you're actually serving down there, and you're also serving further south, correct?
So we're working on setting up in this area called Tapachula. Tapachula is the southernmost city in Mexico, where when people first cross into Mexico, sort of where they first come into contact with, there's about 50,000 refugees down there who have pretty terrible conditions currently. So we're working on getting that set up and running. And we still, sort of keep an eye on things in the Middle East and try to support there as much as we can as well. Our operational model is a little bit unique in that all of our full-time staff also are medical providers. I'm a nurse practitioner. My director of operations is a paramedic. My plans chief is a flight paramedic. We have a number of nurses that work with us, other nurse practitioners. And so that means that when we need to respond somewhere, we can always just grab our core staff and go and set things up. And it makes us more versatile and just more capable, and gives us a really good understanding of how our work on the ground needs to be supported. We've expanded, we've grown a lot this last year. We went from $20,000 in debt basically in early 2019 to now being fully funded at around, this year's operational budget was about 1.2 million.
Wow.
Next year it'll be probably about the same, if not closer to 2 million.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on turning that ship around. And so that brings me to a question about what it's been like going from volunteering, really kind of being the boots on the ground, which you still are, but from being on the board to being now you're non-voting, but you're the executive director. Like, you were doing the work, but it's a lot different having that title and actually being in that position with the organization. How has that been for you? When I think about what you've shared as far as your training goes, you hadn't really had training to be an executive director. So how's that been?
I had some business experience from helping my parents run a family business. I sort of had some base understanding there. I will say that the lab has been a huge asset to me, and being able to ask questions and read other people's questions, which then are like, oh, I never knew this. Like, I did a substantial amount of my own research and education to understand my role and responsibilities and sort of what that needed to look like. It's been a journey. I will say that from running the organization standpoint, having started at the bottom and sort of working my way through has really sort of benefited me. I set up our Google advertising grant. I know all of the things about our Google advertising because I'm the one that learned it. I read books and spent hours researching and then physically set it up. I did all that. I know about our social media fundraising because I set it up. They did the same thing. And so I will definitely say that Google and the lab have contributed to my knowledge of the things that I need to do. And then, my approach is kind of keep it simple, have a budget, stick to it. If you can't stick to it, something else has got to change, and I feel bad for my employees sometimes because they'll be like, hey, can we afford, this thing at $250? And I'm like, do you want a check that's $250 short? If the answer is no, then no, we can't afford it. It's not in the budget. You really have to be diehard committed to those things, because if you're not, that's how you end up $20,000 in debt.
Right.
I tell people all the time, the easiest thing to do is to $5 and $10 yourself to death. It's just $5. It's just $10. You do that 100 times, that's $5,000, $500, and it grows. And so as I've sort of pulled us out of the trenches and sort of reestablished us in the working space, it's been one of the things that I've been really committed to, is making sure that we're financially sound and that we're making smart decisions. I look at every single expense that comes out of the organization. I am incredibly I'm a stickler for did you use a coupon? Did you get the 15% off? Did you price check that? Did you, shop around? I'll tell my staff all the time, free is better than cheap. Cheap is better than expensive. So having to kind of start and to find other people who also have that same mentality, because if we get it wrong, we're all out of jobs next year. So
right. It takes a lot of money to do what you're doing.
It does. And we do it very fiscally responsible. This year we had over $1 million in donation in kind medical services that were donated to us through volunteers, working at our clinic. We have a very efficient model for how we set things up. I run things very much so like I did in the military. In terms of, if you've ever been in the military, you absolutely understand that there's a difference between a want and a need. I want 4 different sizes and syringes. That just makes my life easier. I need maybe 2. And making some of those kind of key strategic decisions is what helps us be financially stable. Look at offices, perfect example. We all work remotely. We've been doing that since before the pandemic. We don't need an office. We want one. It might make storage a little bit easier, but we don't need one. Air conditioning. I don't need air conditioning. I want it. Trust me, I do. Working in 110-degree Mexico, I want air conditioning. I don't need it. And so, that was one of the things that came up a couple months ago. They wanted us to buy $400 in mini split air conditioners. And I said, listen, it's not in the budget and we don't need it. We all want it, but we don't need it. Everybody's sort of groused about not getting an air conditioner. But it's those kinds of decisions that you really have to be kind of brutal in making, because if not, you're not sustainable.
And in situations like that, where you want, and we'll say really, really, really want air conditioning, do you ever reach out to the manufacturers and let them know what you're doing and see if possibly somebody would donate that, or maybe a donor would give a specific donation just to provide that? I understand the difference between a need and a want, and yet I also could see some of those wants would maybe help them, have a little bit more stamina during the day or something like that. That could really contribute.
Yep.
Yeah.
We try to be as innovative as possible in terms of using technology, utilizing partnerships, utilizing our volunteer base to source things that we need or that we want, however that plays out.
Yeah.
You really have to get creative in how you approach those things. We have some great partnerships who have done amazing work in terms of donating different supplies that we need and things like that.
Yeah.
And then sometimes when it doesn't pan out, it just has to be the hard, I'm sorry, guys, and for our organization specifically, we make very clear to people, our clinic in Mexico runs 6 hours a day. And everybody says oh, why don't you run it 12 hours a day? And I'm like, listen, it's physically hard. One, you are out in the elements. We have a mobile medical unit that we use, but you're walking outside in a camp. It's hot, it's windy. Water is not always easily available. It's challenging. And then emotionally taxing because you're standing in the middle of a refugee camp. Somebody best explained it as death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
It's not the same type of trauma that I saw in Iraq where people were coming to me with gunshot wounds and amputations and things like that. But it's these other types of traumas, seeing women who've been mutilated, seeing children who've been tortured, coming into families who've been tortured, who've been kidnapped, things like that. And those kinds of things, you don't realize it until a week later, you're sitting in the hotel and you're like, dang, why am I depressed? And you're like, oh, that's right. I'm working with refugees. I need a little bit of self-care to kind of balance it out. But yeah, we're very open with people that it's
Yeah.
not easy work. And there's
Yeah.
a reason, I will say, even I think in some of my staff, I think that people sometimes see what we do at surface level and
Mm-hmm.
are like, that sounds so cool. You're going to war zones, and they see sort of like the 30-second commercial and they're like, yeah, this is amazing. And what they don't realize is like everything else that goes with it. Like there's a reason that people don't do this, and it's because it's really hard. And, I think that having that perspective sometimes to keep in mind that like there are days now where I'm like, oh my God, do I want to do this for another 2 years? Ooh, like right now, like I've got, trust me, my to-do list sitting next to me is like 5 pages long, like some of it is not easy stuff that I have to figure out. And I'm like, man, I don't know if I want to do this. But then there are other days like when we get a pregnant woman whose baby has a severe congenital heart defect and we're able to like get her somewhere safe and to a hospital that can care for the baby, and we literally save a life. I mean, those days are pretty great,
Yeah.
and so it's, you ride this roller coaster of like highs and lows. It's, I think, sort of like you mentioned before, it's important sometimes to keep that context of like why we do this.
Mm-hmm.
And to have that like pep talk that you give yourself on hard days, because
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of them.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And especially for you as you're getting ready to welcome a new member to your family
Yeah.
and the changes that are going to come along with that, and just the emotions as well, keeping that in check, because it is like a legit emotional thing.
Yeah.
And so as we wrap up our conversation, I'm curious what's ahead for you. So we're right in the beginning of October now, and we've got an election in a month. What do you foresee as far as global response management, let's say through the end of this year?
So our big priorities for the end of this year is we're looking at expanding into some other areas, sort of as things have changed. In Matamoros, we need to reach our population sort of different areas because they've been sort of displaced from their displacement. So trying to figure out that, starting to set up shop in southern Mexico in Tapachula, which we just got funding for, and then really planning out for 2021. The reality is we don't anticipate, regardless of how the election goes, like politics aside, we know like if the current administration gets reelected, nothing will change and our work will still be needed, if not even more so. We know that if the new candidate gets elected, then we anticipate there to be some changes, but not likely to be in the first 100 days. And so we still anticipate our work to be needed. It's just sort of how and where and sort of adapting to changes that might come that way. We actually did meet with Jill Biden. She came down and actually toured the camp, and I spent a good deal of time talking with her about the various impacts of why this work is important and why we should be doing something about it. But then now with baby on the way, November 12th, I'm trying to keep my team set up so that they can take things over for a couple weeks so I can sort of take some time off and sort of be in the background a little bit.
Yeah.
But this is also my passion, so I'm not really sure how time off is going to go.
I know. I remember when I was my son Zachary, and it was the weekend before. So I had gone in for my 38 week and they wanted to deliver like that day. And I'm like, no, this is my goddaughter's birthday and I don't want that. And I'm not ready anyway. I still had a website I was working on. And I remember like my husband has this picture of me like trying to get a stain out of the carpet on that Sunday afternoon. Like I'm 9 months pregnant on the floor, scrubbing the stain that's probably been there for 3 years, but I guess they call it nesting.
Yeah.
So just getting ready for that baby. And then, the baby finally comes and you can kind of relax a little bit. But when you're this passionate and you're running this organization, you'll figure it out. You will totally figure it out, and it's going to be fantastic. And so you're going to have just this bigger heart, your heart's just going to get even bigger. And I'm so excited for you and just wish you a quick recovery from the delivery and healthy baby boy.
Thank you.
And some good family bonding with your husband and with his traumatic brain injury, and how this is really going to bring some new change and some good times, some fun times, and maybe some challenges that you're going to figure it out and you're going to get through this. And it's just, life is interesting. you know?
Very excited. I keep telling people I'm excited to bring into the world a feminist, humanitarian,
There you go.
outspoken advocate to add to
There
our
you go.
hippie collective. So
I have to say, yeah, my son, he's definitely his own man. Yeah. And he's very, very excited to be able to vote in his first presidential election.
cool.
So very exciting. So I am going to put some show notes together and make sure that we let people know your website and everything. But what's the best way for people to get in contact with you and also to make a donation? Would it be on your website?
Yeah, so the best way to make a donation is definitely the website. Up on the right-hand side, there's a donate link that'll take them to our Network for Good donation site. And then for contacting me, you can just put my email on there.
Okay.
helenp@global-response.org, and people can feel free to reach out and ask questions or whatever. I can't say that I'm really that good for advice because my first step is always to Google it.
Well, what would we do without Google? I mean, I think we've just kind of stopped trying to memorize anything anymore, and we can just Google it.
Yeah.
Congratulations on your pregnancy and, becoming a mom. And you've been taking care of kids for a long time. So I think this is just going to be very natural for you.
Yeah, I'm excited. I know that it's going to change everything completely, but it's just a part of
But it's a good
life.
change.
And it's part of the journey, so I'm looking forward to it.
That's it. Yeah.
And then I'll have to send you, I don't know if you guys want to post it, but if people want more context specifically about like what's happening in Matamoros, This American Life did an awesome story on the camp, and like it really gets into like why it's so dangerous and like kind of everything that's happened. And I can send you the link to that if you guys want to that.
Yeah, I'll put it on the show notes page. And so anybody who would like more information can watch that. Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you, Helen. And I really appreciate this opportunity to interview you. And I will see you in the village.
Thanks so much. Talk soon.
Thanks for listening. To access the show notes or share feedback on this podcast and link over to our socials, visit our website at yournonprofitlife.com. That's yournonprofitlife.com. And hey, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you're going to love The Village. It's our exclusive online community where we take what we're learning in the Nonprofit Leadership Lab and apply it. We take it to the next level with live Q&As, boot camps, online book clubs, and legit support from experts committed to helping you extend your nonprofit life. By the way, since we're just getting started, it would mean the world to us if you'd subscribe to the podcast and leave a great review on iTunes. The reviews will help us get the podcast in front of more people as we try to take the whole sector from messy to thriving. See you next time.